this week we're answering one of our other big questions. So, have you guys ever had somebody that you look up to, that you idolize, that you kind of wish you could be like? For me, it was when I was a freshman in high school. So freshmen, raise your hand. Okay, when I was a freshman in high school, I was on the basketball team, okay? So, and I don't want to brag or anything, but I was pretty good at basketball, okay? Just not the greatest, but I was pretty good. And there was a guy who was a senior. His name was Caleb Hutchcraft. And in practice one day, we were scrimmaging, and it was the JV versus the varsity. And so me, being a freshman, I was on the JV team. We didn't have freshman JV and varsity. We just had JV and varsity. So I was point guard, and Caleb Hutchcraft was point guard. He was a new transfer to our school, and he only came basically the second semester of his senior year so that he could play basketball at our school. And so that was fun, but he was really, really good, and I got schooled every time I was going to. I didn't make it more than 3 feet past half court before he stole it, every time. So if you ever want a humbling moment, then, play somebody who's much better than you at whatever sport you're in. But he was not only just really athletic and really a great basketball player, but he was a super nice person too. He was one of those guys that you would expect would be a super high on himself kind of guy, because he had the skill to back up any kind of pride if he wanted to have it. But he didn't live in that. He was just super nice. He was a solid Christian. He was he was not only a leader on the court, he was a leader off the court. And so he did a really good job at including people. He went to my youth group, and so he actually was really inclusive. He was one of those seniors that just made every freshman feel welcome and cared for. And so he was one of the guys I really looked up to, because he was just one of those all-around nice guys that really you gravitate towards. It's somebody that you want to be like, somebody that you're if I were anything like that person, I'd be okay. I could live with myself, because everybody likes Caleb. Everybody likes whoever, fill in the blank, that you look up to. And so the big question that we're going to ask today, we're going to answer, is the question, who am I? So this has to do with identity. This has to do with where we find our worth. This has to do with who am I? And a lot of times when we're asking this question, we're actually asking a lot of different questions other than that. We tend to base who am I based on what we do, right? Even as an adult, if I walk into a room, or if I'm in line at the BMV, as they call it here in Indiana, not the DMV, and I'm just next to a really talkative person or something, and hey, hi, how are you? What do you do? It's like when people ask about you, they ask what you do. So in your guys' place, it might be well, I play basketball, or I whatever. And so we tend to associate what we do with who we are. And so that lends itself to a few problems, but we can tend to base our identity based on what others expect of us. So if there's a standard that your parents have, that your coaches have, that your teachers have, and it's the standard for your life, we can define our identity based on the expectations that others put on us. Whether we're good enough in our grades, whether we're good enough on the field or on the court, whether we're good enough in whatever it is that we're involved in, but we tend to base our identity off of expectations that people have for us. Another thing that we do is we tend to base our identity on areas that we feel judged by others. So if we're not good enough at X, Y, or Z, then we feel judged by that. And we base our identity based on, well, I am not funny enough, smart enough, good-looking enough, or whatever it is, fill in the blank, talented enough. And so we can either, again, base our identity based on what others expect of us, base our identity off of judgments of others, or sometimes we tend to base our identity on our image, what we're able to put out on social media, what we're able to compose about ourselves when we're around other people. It's the part of ourselves, the mask that we put on, and not a COVID mask, right? We portray a different image to other people. And so we base our identity based on what others either expect of us, how others judge us, or how others see us. And we use all those things, and we kind of put those things together and stir it together in this little stew, and then we look and say, okay, that's who I am. And sometimes, obviously, it's not a conscious decision, but those are the questions that we wrestle with when we're wrestling with who am I? And at the bottom of all that is, am I enough? And so a lot of times when we're trying to figure out who we are, which relates to our purpose, which relates to what our life is going to be about, which relates to, am I enough? We're always asking ourselves and questioning if we are enough. We're always trying to figure out if we meet the standard. And you either fall on two sides of this most of the time. The question, am I enough? Some of you might answer, yes, I am enough, but I could always be better. Or I am enough in this area, but I really need to work on this over here. Don't look at that, right? Or sometimes, you know, people, when you're talking to them, they have to self-identify their flaws to let you know that they know, because somehow that makes it better. I do this all the time. It's like, well, you know, I think I'm good at this, but really, I could work on this, and I need to do this better. And sometimes we're our own worst critic. And so, yes, I'm enough, but, and then you have to give an explanation to it. Or we answer the question, am I enough, by saying, no, I'm not enough because, and then it's basically the same thing. Because I don't measure up in these areas. I don't get these grades. I don't get whatever it is that your standard is of enough. And oftentimes, our flaws overshadow the things that we're good at. How many of you could get like 100 compliments on, let's say you're in the play or you were coming off the field and you had a great game. You could get 100 compliments on something that you did, but you're going to remember that one negative comment that somebody said to you. Okay? It's just our nature. We focus in on the negative. And so oftentimes when we're trying to figure out who we are and we're stacking that up with this underlying question of am I enough, it can leave us feeling pretty empty. So I probably don't have to tell you this, but this is something that humanity has wrestled with since the beginning of humanity, basically. Ever since sin entered the world, ever since that we've fallen from the perfect state that we were in the garden, we've been wrestling with our identity and whether or not we are enough. And so we're always trying to just compete. It's kind of like everything is performance-based. And so even back in Jesus' time, when Jesus walked in the earth, this is something that everybody struggled with. And so we're going to take a look in the Gospel of John. And John was one of Jesus' closest disciples. And so he wrote down this event that happened. So let's check it out. This is going to be a lot of reading. So it'll be on the screen, but hang with me. I promise it'll be worth it. So after this, Jesus went across the Galilee Sea, that is the Tiberias Sea. A large crowd followed him because they had seen the miraculous signs that he had done among the sick. Jesus had been healing people. Jesus went up to a mountain and sat there with his disciples. It was nearly time for Passover, the Jewish festival. Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him. He asked Philip, "Where will we buy food to feed these people?" Jesus said this to test him, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "More than half a year's salary worth of food wouldn't be enough for each person to even have a little bit." So right away, Jesus wants to play host. He wants to feed the people who are following him, who have probably heard him teach, but definitely have heard of the miracles that he performed in healing the sick. And so they're following him, and they're hungry. And Jesus goes, "Hey, let's feed them," asks his disciples. And it's enough people that Philip's like, "Hey, it would take a year and a half of work, and we still wouldn't have enough for people to have even a little bit." So Jesus, knowing all this, he knows that there's actually something that he wants to do. And oftentimes in the Gospels, when we read a miracle that Jesus performs, it's not just to show how cool he is. It comes with a purpose. So when Jesus performs a miracle, he often calls it a sign, or he says, "I do this so that," or whatever it is. And it's to prove that he is who he says he is. He proves his authority. If someone tells you something that you know is impossible, but then they do something that you know is impossible right in front of you and then tell you that impossible thing, are you much more likely to believe them? Right? And so Jesus performed miracles to prove his authority, to prove he is who he says he is. And so Jesus, knowing this and knowing what he was already going to do, he goes ahead and he performs this miracle. So Jesus continues. He says, "Have the people sit down." There's plenty of grass there. They sat down, about 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took bread, and I skipped over a part here, but they were looking for where to get it. So this boy, if you've heard the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, this boy comes out, and the disciples are like, "Here, this kid, has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." And so what's probably happening is the disciples are going, "All right, anybody, does anybody have something to eat?" And this boy probably stands up and he's like, "Well, I've got this. You're welcome to it." And his disciples were probably like, no, anybody else? And then everybody else was probably like, "No, we're hungry and we work hard for our food and food's expensive, so no, we don't have anything." But this boy's like, "Here, me, pick me." And so the disciples are like, okay, come here. Here, Jesus, this isn't enough. This is this boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's all we could find. But what we know is, well, I'll just keep reading, and then I'll come back to that. So there's plenty of grass there. They sat down. Then Jesus took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he distributed it to those who were sitting there. He did the same with the fish, each getting as much as they wanted. When they had plenty to eat, he says to his disciples, gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing will be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves that had been left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw that he had done a miraculous sign, they said, this is truly the prophet who is coming into the world. Jesus understood that they were about to come and force him to be their king, so he took refuge again alone on the mountain because his time had not yet come. So here's a couple things that we need to notice about this passage, because if you grew up in church and you've heard this story before, how many of you have heard this story before? Okay, pretty much everybody's heard the feeding of the 5,000. What we often don't understand is that this boy, who a kid was more like property back then, because he wasn't of age yet, and so most of the time people had kids to help them with the family business, to be more labor for them, and to help take care of the family. So this boy was probably not seen as somebody very credible. The barley loaves of bread that he brought was the kind of bread that poor people eat. So he didn't come from wealth. He didn't come from status. He was just a kid. Probably everybody else ignored him. We don't even know if it was a boy or a girl. But then his willingness is actually the highlight of the story. Because then Jesus takes it, somebody who even the disciples thought this isn't enough. This boy probably thought this isn't enough, but here you go. And what Jesus is able to do is he's able to take our not enough and make it more than enough on his own. The youth of the story, he was not given a name, not coming from wealth or privilege, not having a lot to offer, was featured front and center of this story. And what's pretty interesting is when we offer what we have to God, even when we think it's not enough, even when we think we don't measure up, what's cool is if we do that with a willing heart to say, here, God, here's what I have, take it. God ends up using it and doing some pretty incredible things with it. And I know this because this has happened in my own life. Just to give you, this is probably the most dramatic story I have when I talk about like stuff like this. But I remember being a senior in high school, okay, and we'd gone on a missions trip to Mexico. So is anybody gone on a missions trip before? Anybody been to Mexico before? This was a part of Mexico that was very poor. It's not like a vacation spot. And we go, and one of the things that we did when we went on this trip was we would street perform. So we had rehearsed like skits and dramas in advance. We'd go and then like crank a boombox and then perform our skits, which in our culture sounds really weird. Sounds like something you would see on like the corner of like Indy or like up in New York or something like that. But we did this in Mexico, and people stop what they're doing because they're not on like a strict schedule like we are, and they just watch. And then we were able to present the gospel to them, and we were able to talk about Jesus, and it was pretty cool. And I remember this guy coming up, and we were just praying with people afterwards. And I'm like your guys' age. I'm in high school. And I believed in God, obviously, or I wouldn't have been there. I believed in the power of prayer, but I'd never seen what I was about to see happen before. And this guy comes up, and there's a lot of people who are malnourished there, and so he comes up, and his eyes are yellow, like the white part is yellow because he doesn't have enough nutrients. And he's saying, you know, I can't really see very well. My eyesight is not very good, and it's debilitating to me. It's hard to, you know, and obviously he wants to be able to see better. And so we all were like, all right, well, can we pray for you? And he's like, sure. So we gather together, and it was me and probably a group of 4 other people. We all kind of huddled up, and we all prayed at the same time. And it was weird because usually, like in our denomination, we all like one at a time pray, you know, and it wasn't like that there. We all just prayed at the same time, and we were all praying that Jesus would open this guy's heart, that he would be able to see evidence that God is real and that Jesus loves him, and also could you help his eyesight get better. The guy says thank you, he walks away. I think that's the end of it, because honestly, when I pray, most of the time, that's the end of it. Like, I walk away, and okay, well, let's see if God does anything. I kid you not, like 30 minutes later, this guy came back. His eyes were not yellow anymore. He goes, I don't know what to tell you, but I can see right now. I can see just as clear. And it was like night. He's like, I can see you plain as day. And thank you for praying for me. And That was the most incredible thing. And the point of that story is not that I was super spiritual or that I had my life together or, I was free of sin or whatever. My point is my not enough was more than enough for God to do what he needed to do in that moment. And so this boy in the story bringing this 5 pieces of cheap bread that he probably got from his family is probably all he had for that day, and this 2 pieces of fish, and the disciples are like, all right, well, that's not enough, but here, Jesus, this kid has this, and Jesus makes it more than enough. And what I want you guys to recognize, because this is what we get wrong with our identity so much, is that we are constantly testing ourselves to see if we are enough. We're comparing ourselves to others. We're trying to see if we measure up by our own standards. And in the world of social media, we can see just how we measure up to our peers and to those who are maybe a little ahead of us. We can see how we measure up. And many of us, we wrestle when we're asking, who am I? We're asking if we're enough. And we wrestle with that. I wrestle with that. But what I want you to recognize and walk away from tonight is knowing that you don't have to prove that you are enough. When it comes to your relationship with God, you don't have to prove you're enough, because your relationship with God and your standing with him is not performance-based. Every other area in your life, that seems to be the case. But with God, you don't have to prove that you're enough. And so just to kind of illustrate my point here, I was testing this out earlier while you guys were running around doing the game, and my tape wasn't working right, so we'll see if this works. But a lot of us play this game in our heads, and this is kind of our mindset, is we have this like imaginary idea of what is enough. And so, again, fill in the blank for whatever it is for you, whatever extracurricular or whatever. But we often think if I can just reach the line and be enough, then I'll be okay. I'll get what my parents expect of me. I'll get the grades that my teachers expect from me, to get the scholarship or to whatever, or to just be self-satisfied with that I did my best. There's that line, did I do enough? For whatever it is. Sometimes we do that and we overachieve. And we think, okay, I feel great about myself. I did enough. I did more than enough. That can sometimes give us a false sense of confidence. Sometimes we reach the mark, sometimes we don't. Other times we fall short and we think that we're enough, but in reality, we're really not. And so this constant struggle with, am I enough? Am I not enough? This is how we view it. And if I don't reach the line, then I'm not enough. And the question of who am I is, well, I'm not enough. And that's our answer, because we live in the negative most of the time. Sometimes the problem with this mindset is that we just play this comparison game where we see, did so-and-so measure up? Oh, well, I'm at the same as them, but expectations are higher for me, so I've got to do more in order to have the same level of enoughness to be where they are. You guys feel like sometimes people don't have to do as much as you, but yet you're still on the same level? And some of us, maybe either we play this comparison game with other people, or we're our own worst critic, and so maybe we pass that line of enough, but then we go, okay, well, now that's the new standard because I know I can do that. So now next time, I've got to raise the bar. And so actually next time, not only am I expected to do what I did last time, but I'm supposed to surpass that the way I did the time before. And so it's this constant hustle and this constant race. Okay, did I measure up this time? Yes, okay. Well, now that's the new standard. So now let's see, can I be enough now? And it just goes on and on and on, and the cycle goes. And both of these mindsets, whether you're comparing yourself to others or comparing yourself to yourself, it's never going to be satisfied, because once you reach enough, then there's another line. And in life, there's always going to be people better than you. There's always going to be people better at whatever it is you do. It's a world of like 8 billion people. There's going to be people better than you. And so you're always going to be playing this game unless there's a different mindset, unless your mindset shifts. And what Jesus says is you don't have to prove you're enough. So what he does is actually, he takes that off altogether, and he says, actually, what you have, that's enough for me. What you have is enough. And Jesus comes along, he says, you're not enough. I can take that and I can make that more than enough. And He'll fill it to exactly where it needs to be. But it's a mindset shift. It doesn't matter what you can or cannot do. What's required of you is that you place your identity in the person who really matters. And it's not a performance. If you are sincere, if you are finding your identity in Christ, in your Creator, in the one that made you, in the one whose image that you bear, then He can take "you're not enough" and make it more than enough. You don't have to prove your self-worth. You don't have to prove anything, because your relationship with God is not performance-based. So my encouragement to you would be, stop trying to compare yourself to others. Stop trying to compare yourself to yourself. Stop trying to reach the unreachable, because you are enough, because Jesus says that you are enough. In fact, He says you're enough so clearly that He came and died in your place to prove that you are enough. You don't have to prove you're enough. He proved you're enough. And that's the message of the gospel. And so now we can move on from this self-identity crisis to, okay, what does God have in store for me? We're going to be talking about that a little more in the next few weeks, so I don't want to talk too much to give it away. But just a couple points of application. When you're feeling like you aren't enough, then here's a couple things that I would encourage you to do. One is ask yourself the question, where in my life do I feel like I'm not enough? So if it is in your sport, if it's in your relationship with God, if it's in your relationship with your friends, if it's whatever it is, identify that. Secondly, when I don't feel like I'm enough, do I tend to respond by hiding, proving myself, or something else? 3, how different would my life look if I stopped trying to prove myself or hide in this area? Or number 4, when I feel that way, how am I going to remember that I am enough? Ask yourself these 4 questions, and that's going to make a difference in your thinking. It's going to force you to identify how you are self-identifying and where the flaw is. And then remind yourself of the truth. Because here's what God says about you. This is Paul in the book of Ephesians. He says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Meaning God has a plan for your life. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that in a couple weeks. But you don't have to prove that you're enough. So before I send you guys to your small groups, I've got a short video to show you guys. This is one of 3 videos that we're going to be showing in this series. And they kind of build off of each other a little bit. So this first video, it's simplistic, but it's going to set the stage for how to dissect this and how to understand this and how to see this through a lens that I think is going to be really helpful moving forward. So check out this video real quick, and then we'll be dismissed to our small groups.